The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP at 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions, comments, or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any content. If you care to, you can send us letters at our new address, which is The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week, we're airing a presentation that Margaret Killjoy gave at Firestorm Books on the release day of her new novella, The Barrow Will Send What It May. This is the second in her Danielle Cain series, which highlights magic, anarchism, queerness, a squatter subculture, and a bunch more. The presentation consisted of a brief intro, a reading, and to end up, a Q&A session. As a warning to listeners, the reading describes the events of a car crash. This occurs between 11 and 12 minutes after the recording starts. It is not graphic, but if you aren't in a good spot to hear that, please feel free to turn the volume down. Also, we have transcribed and re-recorded the questions in the final section, not because anything said was sketchy, but just to not air people's voices that may not have wanted to be broadcast. To find copies of Margaret's book, you can go to tor.com and search her name or the title of the book, and to see more of her work, you can visit birdsbeforethestorm.net. To hear an interview that we did with her on the release of the first novella in this series, you can visit our blog and search her name. Right now, you are listening to Nomadic War Machine's new release, which is Margaret's solo music project called The Fields Lay Fallow.
First, here are some announcements. This year, incarcerated human rights activist Comrade Malik Washington in Texas put out the call for an International Day of Actions in solidarity with the movement to end prison slavery on Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a holiday celebrated on the 19th of June every year to commemorate and celebrate the end of legalized slavery in the United States. However, as prison rebels from Alabama to Texas to Florida and beyond have pointed out, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which supposedly ended slavery, actually carves out an exception for people who have been convicted of a crime, meaning that slavery was never fully abolished, a condition of exploitation and dehumanization clearly visible within the brutality of the U.S. prison system. In response to this call, Blue Ridge Anarchist Black Cross will host a Juneteenth event at 5:30 p.m. on June 19th at Firestorm Books at 610 Haywood Road. We will screen Ava DuVernay's award-winning documentary 13th, discuss how people can get involved in the movement to end prison slavery, and send some cards to prisoner rebels who need a little love and light right now. 5:30 p.m., June 19th at Firestorm. Hope to see you there. And speaking of Comrade Malik has a special June 19th message for his comrade, Sean Swain, who you all know very well if you listen to this show. From Comrade Malik. Revolutionary greetings, comrades. It's me, Comrade Malik in Texas. This June 11th, I'd like to ask all of you all to send some love, light, and commissary cash to my brother in struggle, Sean Swain, in Ohio. Sean has dedicated a lot of time and effort to supporting and sustaining the work done by the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. Sean has edited our publications and provided much-needed direction for our abolition movement. Sean continues to make personal sacrifices for the good of all, and he never ceases to speak truth to power. In the following months, I hope to work directly with Sean so we can tear this entire thing down. Hopefully, I'll become an honorary 13th monkey. In struggle for life, Malik.
Thanks everyone for coming. I guess and so I'm going to do a reading from this book and then talk about it or ask people ask questions if they want. it's been a really interesting thing. This is like the series, the Danielle Cain series, is like my like mainstream published books. All my other books are published by anarchist presses, aka me and whatever friends I trick into helping me publish my books. Whereas in this case, there's like people who get paid way more than I do to edit my books than I get paid to write them, who live in New York City. And it's been a really interesting thing because then my books have a very different audience suddenly than like what I'm used to. And it's been really heartwarming in this like really cheesy, earnest way. Like all of these people who are just like talking about how excited they are to see. It's usually people coming from a queer perspective, not necessarily an anarchist perspective, like to see themselves represented in fiction and then get really excited about how all the characters are like travelers and wanderers and murderers and stuff. And I guess most of the people aren't murderers, but depending on how you look at it. I don't know, and so that's just been like something that's been on my mind in the past couple days, like with the lead up to this book, because there's been like PR stuff happening about it, and so like just seeing reviews from people who I don't think would have encountered anarchist books in other ways, and also in vice versa, it's been like really neat to be like finding a lot of people who are like also my people who are like not necessarily in anarchist circles, just because they're also like all these weirdos and trans people who just really like science fiction and fantasy, and one of those people sent me cupcakes, and you all heard me tell the story 8 times, but I'm going to say it again because I'm so excited about it. Just because, I don't know, my friend Mimi, Mimi Mondal, just got a Hugo nomination for her work editing a book, I think, about Octavia Butler's work. And the thing that's really exciting about it, besides like a lot of things, like this is someone who's an amazing writer who I went to a writing workshop with, who has total imposter syndrome, but also she's born and raised in India and is trying to live in the US because she might get murdered for her views if she goes back to India. And so it's really funny to me that like I had a book come out, but they not only had a book come out, but they got Hugo nominated, and they remembered to send me cupcakes, and so I'm a little embarrassed. But anyway, so I just wanted to shout out me. And then also, just because the book is dedicated to, I guess most of y'all probably didn't know, a friend of mine from the Triangle area who I lived with in Raleigh when I wrote the first book. I lived with my friend Will, who died a year ago, almost today. I think in less than a week. He died a year ago, and so this book is dedicated to him, boy and male. And yeah, which is funny because the first book was dedicated to a different dead friend. Hooray. I'm just going to read this book. I'm going to read for a little while, and then probably like a chapter and a few paragraphs. We'll see how it goes. Oh, and it's going to have total spoilers for the first book, but I figure I wrote it, so I'm allowed to like spoil it. I don't know, it seems to be the way it goes in my head. And then also, I don't know, like Romeo and Juliet spoiled at the beginning, right? They die. Okay, 1. The towering bursts of flame that staggered their way across the empty black horizon weren't helping my mood. I'd been dozing in the backseat of the car, my head against Bryn's shoulder, but the staccato, silent bursts were too eerie to sleep through. Where the hell are we? I asked. Outside, as far as I could see, were featureless plains. No stars in the sky, just blackness and fire. Hell's about the word for it, Bryn said. She was gazing out the window, her face lit a little by the interior lights of the car, and a lot by the occasional streaks of fire outside. A single thick black tattoo line cut its way down her face from her short bangs to the bridge of her nose, and her face was severe, even more severe than usual. Or maybe I was just drowsy. The rest of the passengers were silent, and we tore down the road through all that darkness. It was gas flaring. As I woke up more properly, I remembered. Must be in North Dakota somewhere. Excess natural gas production, beyond what they've got the infrastructure for, gets burned off. I'd never seen it with my own eyes, those flames that stood in monument to the wastefulness of civilization. My left shoulder ached where thread, regular sewing thread, held together a crowbar wound. My right hand was sore, still, and mottled with supernatural gray where an undead goat had bitten it. Behind us, 1,000 miles of highway ago, was nothing. dead bodies, and probably some investigators who wanted explanations we couldn't really give. A demon killed those police officers, sir. It wasn't us. They probably shouldn't have pulled guns out around a blood-red, three-antlered deer with obvious supernatural agility. So whose fault was it, really? No one would believe us. A week ago, I wouldn't have believed us. We couldn't go back. Ahead of us, there was also nothing. We had a sort of scattershot map of towns with friends who might shelter us, of places that might have books or witches who could teach us. Doomsday was convinced that if we made it to the Washington coast, we'd eventually find people who would get us on a boat to the islands off the coast of Canada. Vulture had a Google map, populated with disappearances and strange phenomena we might look into, but none of us had anything concrete. No real plans, only chaos. This is how we're meant to live. Thursday drove for 16 hours straight, his fists gripping the wheel at 10 and 2. No music on the stereo, but the ethereal, washed-out voices of AM radio preachers were on sometimes. I think they were telling us we were going to hell. I always assume that voices like those are telling me that. We left the fields of fire behind us just as the sun edged over the horizon behind us. Thursday pulled into a rest area to watch dawn, maybe eat something. But once the engine was off, he didn't even make it out the driver's seat before he fell asleep. The rest of us, better rested, leaned against the car in the chilly morning air and watched that sunrise. If you stay up all night, you owe it to yourself to watch sunrise, every time. Vulture passed around a tiny bottle of orange juice he produced from somewhere, maybe his hoodie pocket, because those blue jean short shorts sure didn't have serious pockets on them. He would have made a good stage magician. He had the right kind of charm, and all his motions were fluid, almost hypnotizing. He smiled easily, and even though his smile rarely looked genuine, when he smiled, you found yourself smiling too. Is this going to work out? Bryn asked, breaking hours of silence. She was sitting on top of the spray-painted red old Honda Civic hatchback, her steel-toed boots hanging down over the side. She ripped at a pomegranate, casting its pulp onto the pavement. Her arms were bare to the shoulder. I'm not sure she owned any t-shirts that still had their sleeves. On a long enough timeline, Doomsday said, no. But it'll work out today. Even if she was only just now learning to weave words into ritual magic, Doomsday had a way of warping the world around her when she spoke. What's more important, I asked, laying low or our new career? It was idle curiosity, nothing more. What mattered was our motion, not our purpose. Laying low, Doomsday said. Find some demons, Vulture said, at the same time. They looked at one another. They'd known each other how long? Years? I'd known them not even a week. Find some demons while laying low? Vulture said. It was his way of conceding. The more we know about magic, the more equipped we'll be able to handle whatever comes at us, Doomsday said. So both, I asked. How the hell do we do both? Magic, Vulture said, grinning. Bryn, probably delirious, laughed with her whole body, her heels banging on the window glass. Shut the fuck up, Thursday mumbled from inside the car. At least, that's what I think he said. It's what I would have said. Thursday would have driven the whole way if we'd have let him, but his protestations were scarcely audible as we helped him up into the back seat. I took his place behind the wheel, Bryn took shotgun, and we ran away from the encroaching day. I've spent most of my life in the flyover states, and their beauty is largely unmatched through the rest of the country, but sometimes the endless expanse is too endless. I spent the full day driving. Vulture was nocturnal by choice, and he snored softly with his face against the glass. Thursday was wiped out. Doomsday was wanted for murder, more actively than the rest of us, and I wasn't excited about being the one who would get ID'd if we were pulled over. Bryn could have taken a turn, I'm sure of it, but I didn't want her to. She looked happy sitting there in the passenger seat. She put her hand on my arm and left it there for a long time, and that settled that. I wanted to be the driver. I drove all day. I used to think I was going to end up a trucker. When I first started hitchhiking 10 years back, I'd been 18, and I'd fallen in love with basically every lady trucker I'd met. Even when that thing happened when I was 19, where I had to stab a man trucker in the hand. Even after that, I'd assumed I'd wind up a trucker. Open road, solitude, books on tape, decent pay. Who wouldn't want to be a trucker? By the time I was old enough for the job, I didn't want it. Mostly because I didn't want any job. I found my niche as a wanderer, and driving on some company schedule just wasn't going to suit me. Still, I was pretty sure I was one hell of a long-haul driver. We crossed into Montana and I kept driving. Glacier National Park was probably the single most beautiful place in the country, and I figured we'd get to sleep there, blend in with the tourists at some campground, if I just kept at it. We made it halfway across the state. I was on a side highway, avoiding the interstate because the occasional small-town speed trap seemed like a better bet than the highway patrol, who might have had an all points to look for us. Some British man was narrating a fantasy book at us from the stereo, Vulture's doing, and the sun was just starting to get low. Bryn was asleep. Everyone in the back seat was quiet, hadn't said a word in an hour. The sun was just starting to look a little low on the horizon. I nodded off. I came to halfway into the oncoming lane and corrected. There was no traffic to run into, just an endless stretch of Montana highway. I slapped myself, it's usually good for 10 minutes or so, and made a mental note to pull off at the next exit, switch drivers. I nodded off again. I'd never crashed a car in my life. When I came to, probably half a second later, I was in the wrong lane again, fully this time. Startled, I corrected fast and saw myself headed real quick towards running off the right side of the road. So I corrected again. Still wasn't thinking, way too fast. The car went up on 2 wheels and my vision got choppy. Blackness. The sunset streaming through the window with the road where the sky should be. Blackness. Maybe I screamed, maybe someone else screamed. Where's the reset button? Like I was a kid again playing Nintendo. Just hit the reset button. Start over from the last save. No, it's actually happening. Blackness. Then it was over. We were 20 feet off the left-hand side of the road. The car was upright again. We'd spun a full 360. The windshield was fucked. A beautiful spider web of fucked, with trees in the distance that I could see through the kaleidoscope of fucked. Guess the car didn't have airbags. What year did airbags get to be standard? Thursday's voice cut through the white noise that I hadn't even noticed. Doomsday. Yeah. Vulture? I'm fine. Bryn? Alive. I freaked out, just started gasping for air. Danielle? I'd rolled the car. I'd almost killed Bryn. Danielle? Fine. I answered because I wanted to be left alone, and answering seemed like the fastest way to accomplish that. I took off my seatbelt. Thank fuck we'd all been wearing seatbelts. Even the people sleeping, even the other people sleeping, had been wearing seatbelts. I opened the door and tried to stand, but my legs gave out, and I collapsed in on myself. Danielle, Bryn said. She was next to me, crouching, her arm around me. I fucked up, I said, fighting for air. I don't need anything. I'm the one who... I gave up trying to talk. I got my head between my knees and I retched out gasps. No tears, though, not yet. Vulture knelt down on the other side of me, put his arm around me, too. I lifted my head up to see him. Wet blood smeared across his brown skin. You're bleeding, I said. I'm fine. Just cut up my arm a little, nothing deep. I fell asleep. We're alive. Vulture pulled aside the shoulder strap of my tank top. Hey, he said, my stitches held. Got to get this thing away from the road before anyone drives by, Thursday said. Into the trees. Vulture glared at his friend, but Thursday was right. We didn't want to deal with cops or ambulances or any of that shit. Bryn tried to help me up, but I shook her arm off. The only thing worse than needing emotional support after what I'd done was stubbornly refusing help that I obviously needed, but I couldn't help it, which made me resent her support even more. Pushing a fucking car, though? That I could do. Vulture and I were tied for being the smallest, but no one made any suggestion that I should get back behind the wheel. Doomsday got in and steered while the rest of us pushed, and we got it into what was probably a tree farm. The trees were in those unnaturally perfect rows, and I was sure the car wasn't completely hidden, but with any luck, we'd gotten it far enough away from the road that it looked like it was supposed to be there. A few cars went by while we were doing it, but none of them slowed down. What's next? Doomsday asked, getting out. Get the VIN numbers off, Thursday said. It's just VIN, Vulture corrected. Vehicle identification number. Like ATM machine or PIN number or whatever. Fuck off. There'll be a plate on the dash, that's easy, I said, cutting in. But it'll also be stamped into the frame a few places. We need a pretty serious file to get it out, even if we could get to all the VIN numbers without taking the thing apart. They talked it over for a moment, then Thursday pried the metal tag off the dash while Vulture and Bryn took off the plates. Close enough for government work, I guess. Me, I leaned against the back of the car. I tried not to take stock of what condition the car was in, but the windows were all busted out and the roof was caved in on the back corner. You all right? It was Doomsday. probably the least emotional of the five of us. Strangely, that helped. I put my hand on the massive dent on the roof. If we'd landed anywhere else, I said. We didn't. Doomsday pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a drag. You smoke? I asked. Not usually, she said. Used to more. Still keep a pack around. But I could use a cigarette. You did almost just kill us all. I'm not going to say don't remind me. I probably won't again. You know what you did. You'll mostly get over it, and there isn't one of us who's anywhere near as mad at you as you are. Thanks, I said. I didn't smoke either. Can I have a cigarette? I don't bump cigarettes out to non-smokers. It's hard to hitchhike with 5 people. Under normal circumstances, the best thing to do would have been to split up into 2 groups. But these obviously weren't normal circumstances. To make things even more fun, we had to get a ride before the cops stopped us and ran our names. None of us had any idea if there were warrants out for us yet, but none of us wanted to find out the hard way. 5 people in luggage. Bryn, Vulture, and I had travel packs. The Days had decent-sized suitcases. All of them were covered in glass, and Vulture's yellow pack was now replete with bloodstains. All right, Doomsday said, dropping her cigarette from her lips, letting it fall to the ground where she stomped it out with a heeled boot. Gather round, hold hands, got a ritual for this hitchhiking shit. We were still in the woods, hidden from the road. I took Vulture's hand and Bryn's hand, and the 5 of us formed a little pentagon. You say what I say, Doomsday said, but like in a round. I'll say a line, then Thursday. You say that line while I say the next one. Then Bryn, Danielle, Vulture. You say the line the person on your left said the last time. After I say the 5th line, you all go on without me until Vulture says the last line alone. Anyone fucks it up, we just start over. First time I tried this method, I fucked up every line once. It's not a big deal. Got it? Got it, we said back. We began. We ask for good strangers. We ask for the Barrow to send what it may. We ask that ill eyes pass over us. We ask for the dead to guard us. We ask that sorrow be held at bay. It took us about 4 rounds to get it right. It's hard to listen to what someone is saying while you're talking, but not as hard as I would have thought. I'm glad I was never the one to fuck up. I don't know how well I could have handled any more failure. I felt the energy pass between our hands. A subtle thing. The kind of thing I might have felt before I'd seen magic. But after Vulture said the last line, a silence fell over us and a wind picked up. A gyre spun itself between us, the same direction as our ritual, then spun outward through the trees. Then that silence. So, I asked at last, the fuck did we just do? It's nothing, Doomsday said. Just a spell for good luck with strangers, keeping people who would hurt us away. And all that shit about the Barrow and the dead? I don't know the spell too well. I think Barrow is the name of an endless spirit it appeals to. He's a death spirit, I guess. But that's not what the ritual is about. Yeah, great. What could go wrong? An SUV picked us up not 10 minutes after we had been waiting. For those keeping score at home, neither being picked up by an SUV, nor so quickly, is common. I mean, both have happened to me before, but usually not while hitchhiking with 5 people, 2 of them being people of color and men besides. Oh, and Bryn had that face tattoo. And Doomsday was a bona fide cop-killing, husband-killing murderer. I actually can't blame anyone who drove past the 5 of us, though, no matter what their car. No one wants to be outnumbered by strangers in their own vehicle. It takes a certain kind of person, one with bravery and belief in doing right by people, to pick up a crew like us. It takes a person like Gertrude Miller, it turns out. Where are you headed, she asked, after the other 4 got in the back and I climbed in shotgun. I'd been designated driver-dealer with her by a rather hasty consensus decision, with the caveat that Thursday be ready to step in if the driver was a creep or just a bro looking to bro down. Gertrude Miller wasn't either of those things. She was a white woman, probably 50, with a vacant look in her eyes and a cold but somehow genuine smile on her face. She had that tired look of a woman who'd done service class work her entire life, and the self-confidence of the same. Out to Glacier, I said. You? It's good practice to ask where a ride is going. Probably more important when you've got reason to be skeptical, like when I'm hitchhiking alone and a man picks me up. If they can't give me a clear answer, I don't get in their car. Pendleton, she said. That'll get you close to Glacier, but I'm afraid the sun will be down before we get there. That's fine, I said. We'll figure it out from there. Thanks for the ride. Anytime, she said. Know why I picked you up? Probably Jesus told her to pick us up, or maybe I reminded her of her daughter, or her granddaughter, or she was worried about me and the company I kept. Why is that, I asked. God told me to, she said. There's some young folks who look just like y'all in Pendleton. They run the library ever since the county gave up on it, and they still run it for free. Never would have thought I'd make friends with someone with a face tattoo. No, I didn't. But these kids are all right. Figured you're all right, too. The smile dropped off her face for a moment as she squinted on the road ahead. Plus, she went on, I've already died once. Ain't got nothing left to fear. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. Instead, she put on the radio. Pop country filled the car. And we drove off into the sunset. That was the first chapter of Book. And then other things happen. Actually, everything works out normally. They get where they're going. They settle down. Turns into a rom-com. Actually, that'd be cool.
It's all library politics after that.
Yeah, basically.
I ended up checking out this book from the library, and this one gets really weird.
Wait, I want to read one more line. Because I just literally took it from Firestorm. They get to the library, and Pendleton Library, still free, still open to the public, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., run by anarchists. Beneath it, someone attacked a piece of paper that read, "We do not carry the anarchist cookbook. Get your bad politics and bad science recipes off the internet, not from us." Probably ramble about it, but if people have questions.
How much Scooby-Doo influence is there in this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's pretty Scooby-Doo.
Scooby's pretty verbal for a
Yeah.
dog.
Well, they no longer have their Honda Civic, and to just like spoil a minor part of it, they get a bookmobile. So they are definitely paranormal investigators driving around in a van. A lot of the stuff that people that, like crime is such an ambiguous word. Like I feel like they are both committing and fighting. I like though that like reviewers have started to pick up on that it's a Scooby-Doo book. The first book was like called. The first pitch that my editor gave when she was actually trying to sell the book to Tor, the publisher, she was like, it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer without the humdrum of suburbia. And that was like the back cover, like elevator pitch for a while. But I feel like now it's more and more, it's like basically like Scooby-Doo with punks. And which is good because I've actually never really watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but I watched a lot of Scooby-Doo. My siblings were into Buffy and I was like, just reacting against anything that they liked. Missed out on a lot of good stuff and Buffy. It's really hard to write group dynamics. It's really hard to write like 6 characters having a conversation, and I realize how much like mainstream white American cultures in most fiction where like conversations are between like 2 people at a time and blah blah blah. Like I've written so many meeting scenes and it's really hard to write a compelling meeting scene. I mean, for obvious reasons, like no one likes being in meetings, so I would. So this does not have meetings, just as a quick pitch. But there are 5 of them, and then they meet like 3 more people that they're running around with. Because I was just like trying to actually respond to like punk's life. You're either goddamn alone for a really long time, or rolling deep with more people than you possibly thought you did. And both are irritated, and you always wish you were doing it. I mean, like years ago, like we were all joking how we were gonna get rolled deep tattooed on our knuckles, and I'm really glad I didn't, because then I spent like 5 years traveling alone in a van. But the first 2 years I had the van, boy, it was always full of people who pissed me off. I mean, wonderful people who totally paved their own way. Any other questions?
Could you talk a little bit more about the reception to your work that you alluded to in the beginning that you've been getting from outside the rad scene? That's really interesting to me because when I read your first book, it struck me as speculative fiction, but instead of speculation, it's just our scene. And I thought that if I were reading this and I weren't part of this scene, it would feel like this incredibly rich, constructed subcultural space that had been invented by the author. So I'm curious how people react to it that aren't anarchist.
I mean, yeah, it's one of the main things people pick up on, right, is that they're like, I mean, some of it makes me sad. People are like, oh, this is like what if punks were decent people? When I was in the punk scene, it was awful and everyone was a misogynist. And I'm like, that's almost certainly true. That's probably 90% of the people who call themselves punk. Fuck. Like, I've been like so blessed, you know? Like, I mean, like, I don't hang out with oogles anymore, but I used to be an oogle and I'm writing these books about these basically oogles, right? And so there's that, the people who are like, oh, I wish punk was that cool, and I want to be like, no, like, this really is, like, an experience that, the way that these characters interact with each other. It's also given me a lot of like, the characterization and the way the characters interact with each other has been like kind of like the main selling point of the books, like in terms of like readers who actually get really excited about the books. And that makes me excited because I think that at the end of the day, like what I care about anarchy is the way that we interact with each other on like a individual and personal level, and having the characters do that well. But yeah, I don't know. I think that also I've been getting like people, like some reviews are like, holy shit, there's this town where people like have a free store, and like that's like this like mind-blowing. In the first book, there's a free store called the Everything for Everyone. And people pick up on things like that and get really excited about it. And ironically, presenting this sort of utopian vision that's critiqued in the first book, but also still cared about. I don't know, that's come up a lot. Yeah, I don't know. People have been, it's funny because a lot of the things that I make, I only get the negative response, right? But with this book, I've been mostly seeing the positive responses. And the other thing that's interesting is that a lot of people, a lot of places assume that these books take place in a post-apocalyptic world because I talk about like an empty town and like squatters. And I'm like, like, no, it's just, what? Okay, like I'm sure, I've never personally walked into like a totally empty town that isn't like me looking on like ghosttowns.org or whatever the hell I'm tracking one down. But squatter life as like seen as like a sign of the post-apocalypse is interesting to me. Yeah. If this book does well enough, because it's like, okay, so that's the other thing, right, is that the first book didn't immediately like find its market because it's so weird for mainstream publishers to publish this. And I think that the publishers were disappointed at first, and then it's actually been in the past couple months that the first book has started to like kind of more find its audience because it pretty much has to spread about through word of mouth. But because it's so niche in some ways, even if it's a niche that once people find it, they usually get excited about it, or at least the people who bother to talk to me about it are excited about it. This whole novella line started as a ebook only thing way back in the day, like 3 years ago when Tor started publishing novellas, which has caused this like resurgence in the novella as a form. It's actually really interesting. It wasn't really, you couldn't really publish novellas for a long time with any success.
Someone makes a comment here about the car crash scene and how they got into an identical car crash about 2 days after Margaret wrote that out for the first time, and sort of makes a lighthearted black magic illusion.
But I also had this thing, there's a bunch of scenes in any given book, most of it shit I make up, but a lot of it is like just like actually taking my experiences or the experiences someone has told me and putting it in like really exactly. And that's usually what editors flag is like, nah, not really. This isn't real. And that car crash was one of them. They were like, is that a realistic way for a car crash? And I'm like, I'm just literally wrote about the time I flipped a station wagon. Like, just the exact which way I turned, and I think I mirrored it. I think I ended up on the right side of the road when I crashed a station wagon, but, and then later in it, she's trying to convince herself whether or not she's concussed, so she's counting back from 100 by sevens, which is what the doctor made me do after I crashed the station wagon. But also that comes up a lot just in general with like writing about our lifestyle, is that like editors are like, no, you're making this shit up, it's too unrealistic. And like, I wrote a story where I talked about a list of jobs that characters had, and it's just like all the weird off jobs all my friends have had. And one of them is like picking moldy grapes for wine, and my editor is like, no, actually, they don't use moldy grapes for wine. And I'm like, I have literally been paid $10 an hour to pick moldy grapes for wine, and got told that the moldy grapes also go in the bucket, and that is part of the flavor. And but then other times editors catch shit that doesn't come from my experience. In the first book, I was like, and then they have like a garden, and I'm like Googling like, what the fuck can you grow in May in Iowa? And I'm like, oh, garden, I traveled too much. And then one of the editors was like, you got all the plants wrong. Try these ones. And I was like, great, thanks.
So in The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion, you had a lot of intention around how the characters identified in terms of gender and race. And then jumping from that, you pay a lot of attention to space, specifically squatted space, and all the attention to detail and functioning that goes along with squatting. Obviously, this comes from lived experience, but how do you bring all of these to form in a way that doesn't come off as too overt?
I mean, a lot of it, The Lamb Was Slaughtered the Lion started off as this wish fulfillment novella. There weren't demons in it, and it was just about a traveler who was sick of traveling, who found a squatted town and was like, hooray, I found a squatted town. And then it like vaguely needed a plot, so then I was like, maybe an insurrectionist jumped a mutualist and everyone thinks it might have been a cop. I literally wrote an entire novella about that. And so then they're all like basically trying to like Sherlock Holmes, they're like figure out who actually attacked the mutualist. And then they had to keep it secret because everyone else will get mad because they're basically being cops because they're investigating things. But they're all really excited to like feel like Sherlock Holmes about that shit. And they were the weirdo goths, and everyone else was like, I don't know, whatever. It was terrible funny. It was total trash. And but I wrote it as wish fulfillment, and so that really carried into like some of the houses were just descriptions of the houses that people had, and houses I've been in, and there's like some line in it about like Jesus Christ, is that a life-size hippo head in the middle of the living room or whatever. And
What got me specifically was the description of how to use candles, because if you're squatting, you don't want to burn the place down.
Yeah, and like thinking about how squatters always know how to either barricade or leave the building that they're in. Yeah, stuff like that. It's like interesting to try and convey, because I also kind of want to like paint. I mean, squatters are so often the bad guys in various fiction and stuff like that, and so I always want to like. I do kind of want to like heroize them, or like give them like the really specific life skills. Yeah, I mean, I try not to go over the top about making them too awesome, but And there's also like the interesting thing that I think about a lot, where I spent years as a traveler, as a wanderer, and I come from a middle class background and like chose to leave college to go wander, right? But I like largely lived around people who that wasn't a choice for, and it's like not surprising that I'm the one who's better in a position to like write about squatters and sell those stories to magazines, and I try to be responsible about that, whether it's through like owning up to my privilege and those choices, but also like the way that romanticization ties into it is very strange. There's someone who wrote a typology of the way that marginalized people are represented in fiction, and then like step one is like they're just like the villains and just like cliche shitty villains, and then like once you try and like make it better, and then there's like token heroes or whatever, and then once you try and make it better, it's like they're perfect, they're all shining examples of humanity and can do no wrong, and that's like a useful cultural terrain to stake out, is like saying like, no, these people, the following oppressed minority, can be like heroes in an almost over the top way, but then eventually you need to be able to reach the point of just turning them into full people and turning them into like also flawed. It's a conversation that I have a lot about trans representation, not as much about like squatter representation, because I literally don't know anyone else writing about squatters or anything like that from a position of experience in science fiction world. Certainly there's a lot of writers now who are coming from working class positions and talk about that. But when I write about trans characters, there's like this, one of the things I thought was interesting is that one of the main audiences, this is a total tangent, one of the main audiences that is picked up on this series is LGBT readers and of science fiction and fantasy, and it's interesting to me because to me I don't really play up those elements. I think that the politics that I'm pushing in the book, not pushing, but the politics that I'm more interested in and focusing in the book are just anti-authoritarianism and anarchism in general, and they just like all happen to be queer, and at least with the first book, that's like, I'm not trying to address those gender issues, which is sort of like me skipping to the end and being like, hooray, what if trans people are just people, right? Like, I'm like, although actually this book, if the first book, if people have read it, the primary theme is that the idea that once you have power, even if it's like anarchists taking power, it can often turn into anarchists using that power in bad ways. And the second book is actually much more specifically about the way people, primarily men, like primarily cis men towards primarily cis women, use love as power and to control other people. And that's totally unrelated, and that's the theme of the book, but hopefully people will pick up on. We'll all become better people.
Are there more demons?
There are endless spirits that are acting out, but they're doing that through human men. Yeah, so there's no personified demons. Hashtag not all demons. Come on, I literally have the demon for my first book tattooed on my arm. I kind of like him, even though he eats people. Sometimes deserving of it. Mostly deserving of it. Any other questions that could trap me into making messenger statements?
You mentioned being affiliated with a publisher in New York. Is that where your publisher is from?
Yeah, so Tor is based in New York City. Actually, in American publishing, I think every mainstream book publisher is based in New York City if you want to be part of publishing. Just totally has nothing to do with how publishing's a bunch of white. It's a specific major problem that's happening right now, and publishers who even want to hire people from marginalized identities are having a hard time because people have a hard time living in New York City. They're not already privileged. Which is actually interesting. I believe Tor, I have this like weird kind of loyalty because Tor really consciously tries to not just publish marginalized voices, but also hire folks from marginalized identities, and has been like kind of like doing a really good job of that. And my publicist was like, oh, well, if you go to Richmond, I know some anarchists there I can put you in touch with. And I'm like, wait, what? You're like, because in my head, I'm like, if you're not in my bubble, then you're a normie. And I'm like, that's garbage. And also, like, just really explicitly not true. My editor reposts stuff about J20 all the time. And chastised me about the way I represented trans women in a book. And was right. And like it was like, yeah, I don't know, it was awkward. It was a different story. I have a story coming out next month from Tor, just like a short story that'll be online about a trans girl who's in love with a mermaid, so she feeds men to mermaids and to the mermaid, and then steals all their money to hire a witch to turn her into a mermaid. But it's a love story, and the way I represented the character, like, my editor was like, is that really the best way to represent this character? Like, fuck you, and I was like, it really isn't. It's not the best way to represent that character. It really would play into the following history of, like, it wouldn't be clear to most readers. Thank you. So anyway, I really like, at the very least, my editor, who's also nominated for a Hugo Award, which I'm really excited about. It's really cool to see. I don't know if you all, like, randomly keep up with science fiction politics, but there was this like massive alt-right, right before the alt-right kind of hit the mainstream, it hit science fiction and a lot of other subcultures and shit, but they were called the Sad Puppies and the Rabid Puppies, and they tried to take over all the awards through like ballot stuffing and like getting all the like legion of trolls to like only vote for white men because people of color were destroying science fiction or whatever. And so there's been this brilliant backlash where like one magazine just releases anthologies called People of Color Destroy Science Fiction, Queers Destroy Science Fiction, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, POC only anthologies and shit like that. Mm-hmm. And they do enormously well. And there's been a lot of space for radical politics beyond just identity issues to like kind of work their way in those spaces. That's my claim, as if I'm trying to do this in order to infiltrate and subvert everyone, whereas actually I'm doing this because I'm trying to have a career and have fewer jobs. Anyone else? Well, thank you all for coming. Also as a random shout out, speaking of anarchist publishing things, there's a short story that I didn't successfully sell for money, so I gave to anarchists, and they did a better job than the mainstream people would have anyway. I learned a lesson. And there's a short story that came out from Detritus Books, and there's a free audio version of it online, and it came out yesterday.
Cool.
And that's awesome, so.
Thanks for listening to this presentation that Margaret Killjoy gave a little while ago on the release date of her novella, The Barrow Will Send What It May. Again, if you're interested in listening to a previous interview that we did with her about the first in this book series, you can go to thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org and just search for her name, or you can visit her website, birdsbeforethestorm.net. To round out the hour, we are going to be presenting a much edited down version of the most recent Error 451, which is our sometimes weekly tech podcast. And this is an interview with Micah Lee of The Intercept about eFail. If you would like to see more of Error 451 or hear the unabridged version, you can subscribe to our podcast feed by searching The Final Straw Radio on any podcast app.
So, in mid-May, the internet became abuzz with announcements of a security hole known as eFail. Can you describe for listeners what was disclosed, what eFail is?
Yeah, so eFail is a kind of broad issue that affected many email clients that did encrypted email. What the researchers basically discovered was that if an attacker has a copy of your encrypted email, so like maybe they are a cop and send a subpoena to Gmail for a copy of your email, and they see that some of it's encrypted, or maybe they like hack into your email account, or any number of other reasons. Maybe they're like a malicious systems administrator or something, and they have access to your email. If they already have a copy of your encrypted message, what they can do is craft an email that's malicious, secretly hide the encrypted message that they have inside of this email, and then send it to you. And then your email program that you use will, as soon as you get the email, it'll automatically decrypt the email and send the plain text back to the attacker. So this is a pretty wide-reaching problem that wasn't just like a problem with GNU PG, which is one of the open PGP programs that's really popular. It wasn't a problem with one thing. It was kind of a problem with the whole ecosystem around how encrypted email works.
How was that figured out?
Basically, I think that, so if for people who use encrypted email like PGP, the way that it works is you have a secret key on your computer, and then you have a public key that you share with everybody and you put up on key servers. And so if someone sends you an email, they take your public key, they encrypt the email to the public key and send it to you. And then on your computer, you get that encrypted email and use your secret key to decrypt it. And so I think the researchers just realized, like, hey, I am using this email client, and I'm noticing that my email client is automatically decrypting emails when I get them and when I open them. I bet there's something here. And then they just did a lot of research on a whole lot of different email clients that support PGP and SMIME, and found out that there was like totally something there, and that they were pretty much all broken in some way.
Is there any sign that this has actually been used to undermine people's email security?
I actually don't know. As far as I know, like, they didn't mention that they've noticed this in the wild in the paper that they wrote. So as far as I know, the researchers just were looking into this and figured it out themselves. I don't know if I haven't heard of any time that, somebody had actually done this attack. Except that the researchers did actually like realize that this was serious and a big deal, and started contacting the people who make software to fix it. And let's see, in November 2017, they contacted Enigmail, which is the Thunderbird extension that adds PGP to it. And in February 2018, they contacted GPG Tools and basically like explained, some of the details of how this works and tried to get them to patch it. And they didn't end up publishing until May 2018. And even by then, like several months later, Enigmail and GPG Tools were both still vulnerable. So actually, like, at the point that they published, because, these people who make PGP software were so slow at fixing it, and even when they did fix it, the fixes didn't work at first. I think that there's still likely a lot of PGP and SMIME users that are vulnerable. And in fact, I think SMIME is much worse than PGP. Most of the like media coverage has been talking about PGP, and I think that it's mostly because journalists that write the media coverage use PGP. But SMIME is used by like banks and major corporations and the Department of Defense. It's very similar to PGP, but it's centralized instead of using the web of trust that uses certificate authorities. And it's very badly broken. And as far as I know, it's not actually like fixed in the major email clients like Outlook that people are relying on for this.
What could you say about the way that fixes for these sort of problems become implemented? It's a pretty difficult thing to approach if you realize this thing is broken and then you have to communicate with companies, but you're trying not to out the problem to people who might misuse that information. But then again, you don't necessarily... there's like a level of trust of the companies that are developing this software or the foundations or whatever. And since it's all so fragmentary and so decentralized, and people might just not do the correct updates on whatever operating system they're using to whatever platform.
Yeah,
right? It seems like a pretty mixed up and confused model.
It is. It is. So what you're describing is called responsible disclosure. So when a security researcher finds a vulnerability in some software, the responsible thing to do is to like privately tell the people who write the software about it and have
it's
them
like, hey, your
it.
zipper's down sort of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. But except that, then as soon as, the problem is fixed, they publish their paper and publish their, blog post and say like, hey, we found that their zipper was down, except that it's, with software vulnerabilities. So with a lot of software, like let's say that you're a security researcher and you find a vulnerability in Firefox that, can make it so if somebody is using Firefox and they visit your web page, you could hack them. Firefox, like Mozilla, has a method for disclosing security bugs to them securely, and they take them seriously. And as soon as they receive a security bug, they like fix it and release an update. And then after a patch is available, then the researchers can basically publish their findings. And this is good to do in general because I think it helps other researchers. It makes everything more secure. The researchers get credit for their research and stuff, and also Firefox is fixed. So the problem with PGP is that there isn't just like one organization like Mozilla to talk to. There's like dozens of organizations, and they have to make like decisions about which ones are more important based on like maybe who has more users or things like that. And most of these organizations are like tiny, scrappy, like open source projects where they don't even have full-time people. Like everyone's a volunteer. Another big problem, especially with PGP, is that the kind of like old school open source scene has some real like blame the user problems where so like the GNU PG project is basically like, this isn't a problem with GNU PG. If you use it correctly, it works fine. The problem is that people are using it incorrectly. And that doesn't help anyone.
Of note too, that like blaming the end user thing is GPG, and even like setting up an Igmail and prodding up a key pair is a complicated thing. And if it makes sense to you, if you're one of the people that created the framework for its implementation. So what are some safer practices moving forward? And are there any other encryption methods that you might suggest listeners consider that are maybe more streamlined and easier to implement?
So the good news is that Thunderbird and Enigmail have fixed this vulnerability. And also just yesterday, actually, GPG Tools fixed this vulnerability if you're like a Mac user and want to use PGP with Apple Mail. So if you do still want to use PGP, it's safe to use it if you're making sure that the email programs that you're using are up to date and secure. And I think that it's pretty important to, if at all possible, disable viewing HTML in your email, because it looks like this will mitigate e-fail problems in the future, different variants of the same attack that still haven't been found. So if you just don't use HTML at all in your email, then that makes you a whole lot safer. But in terms of PGP itself just being very confusing and very hard to use and very easy to make mistakes. Now there's a lot of options for encrypted messaging apps that in many ways are actually more secure than PGP and that are much easier to use. And so the big one is Signal. It's a mobile app, and there's a desktop version for it. And there's a handful of other ones, but I think that Signal kind of does the best practices on everything. And one of the big downsides of it is that you need to attach your phone number to it. So if you don't have a phone number, or if you don't want to share your phone number with people, then it's a bit harder to use, but it's very secure.
Like, I've heard people voice concerns before about having, like, with Signal, having to get an account to get it through the Google store or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you use Android, it's actually, Signal has now started letting you directly download an APK from their web. I forget exactly how to find it, but it's on signal.org. So if you use Android and you're one of those people who doesn't use the Google Play Store, it is actually possible now to get Signal without using the Google Play Store.
There was an episode of On the Media recently where, like, one of the midweek short episodes that they do, where one of the hosts mentioned Tor, mentioned Signal, and mentioned other encryption apps and platforms and paradigms. And the person that was being interviewed was talking about how a lot of the focus on these apps and this form of ubiquity of encryption, in a way, like, there's a reason that some of these big foundations or some of these government agencies have started out creating these apps, then passing them on to other people, because the ubiquity of anonymized encrypted information, or they can also, like, the NSA can easily use some of these channels. It has the danger of creating this false sense of security of the users that actually what they're doing is free and clear of being collected and being analyzed by third-party actors. Do you think that's like a useful consideration that end users should be taking into mind when they're considering using encryption?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's really important to realize that security is a holistic thing. It's not just like using an app and then suddenly you're secure, because it's impossible for a messaging app to protect you from, like, a security camera that's looking at your phone as you're using it, right? And so whenever you're taking steps to make yourself more secure, there is this process called threat modeling that security people do, and it really involves figuring what specific threats you're worried about, and then figuring out ways to mitigate those specific threats. And so no apps, just the apps alone are secure. There's no type of operating system or whatever. There's no best practices that everyone solves and then they're secure. Instead, it's oh, well, if you are a journalist covering Mexican drug cartels, maybe using Gmail is a great way to protect yourself, because the Mexican drug cartels don't have the ability to send subpoenas to Gmail. But if you're an American journalist covering stuff like this, maybe using Gmail isn't a good idea. And so that sort of thing applies to everything. So there's always trade-offs with what messaging apps to use. There's always trade-offs with what apps to use. And really, if you really need to be secure, you really need to figure out exactly what you need to be secure from and make a plan to make that work. So one example with Signal is, it's true, if your phone gets compromised, if there's some other malicious app on your phone, it could totally be spying on what you're doing on Signal. But let's say you really, really need to have a secure conversation with somebody. One option will be to actually just go get a separate phone, don't tell anybody about it, and use that separate phone to have your secret conversations. So if anyone tries to compromise you and successfully hacks your phone won't have any access to your other phone that you're having the secret conversations with. So I think that a lot of the security stuff is really thinking through what the problems you're having and how you're trying to think of solving them, and then coming up with a solution for those specific problems.
Word. Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, thank you.